Japanese hardcore, more commonly referred to as J-core, is a variation on the hardcore techno music genre widely theorized to have emerged during the mid-1990s. The genre is often defined by a combination of fast-paced melodies, overt visual and musical styles taking cues from contemporary otaku subculture, and heavy sampling from other closely related mediums like anime, video games, and general Japanese pop/meme culture. Additionally, many J-core works are self-published like other mediums under the doujin subculture, with labels under the umbrella often sharing spaces at major conventions like Comic-Con. These elements are believed to have shaped perceptions of the genre as a fleeting and underground scene, partially due to early otaku culture skirting a very fine line with the use of copyrighted and unlicensed material. While the genre initially garnered inspiration from hardcore techno, gabba, and later happy hardcore following the turn of the millennium, early works under the J-core umbrella share many elements with nerdcore techno, another underground genre characterized by the heavy use of samples from other similar sources. It can be argued that this overlap in musical style was a catalyst for the ambiguity of J-core as a definition, as many self-published works, broadly ranging from jungle to speedcore, were often lumped into the J-core genre with little distinction within the greater doujin music sphere. A variety of composers within the video game industry, like sampling masters Mega and LED, are often cited as inspirations for a number of J-core artists and the overall hardcore techno sound cultivated by the genre, which further blurs many early distinctions. On the other hand, it can also be argued that J-core is a spiritual successor to the foundations that nerdcore techno established, namely the recognition of otaku culture through the parodies and sampling of popular contemporary works. Many music databases like Discogs will clump releases from the late 90s into both categories interchangeably, suggesting a continuity that has since branched into two distinct forms of music over the last 25 years. The term J-core is itself a relative misnomer, as many producers surrounding the doujin scene see no particular distinction regarding hardcore music produced in Japan. DJ Shimomura, an established hardcore producer and DJ, often described as a pioneer of J-core sounds, argues that he does not have the consciousness of making J-core when producing music. He suggests that his perspective is probably the same for many Japanese artists, as the term encompasses multiple varying sounds with no uniform direction in mind to codify them, likening the expression to baggage exported from Japan overseas. This theory is supported by the titles of many doujin music tracks uploaded to YouTube during the site's early years, regardless of any correlation between two different compositions. A song could have its genres correctly labelled in the video description, but will invariably be listed as J-core, despite having little in common with releases from the early 2000s. Regardless of the term's overall accuracy, J-core has served a critical purpose in highlighting the influences and trends that inspire underground Japanese electronic artists to produce tracks much different from their contemporaries across the pond. Nonetheless, this is yet to address a key question. What are the origins of J-core, and how did it develop throughout the early 2000s? Many articles and artists alike list DJ Sharpnel as the origin point for J-core, being one of the first artists to release music that would later define an early understanding of the genre. He was partly inspired by his experiences at New Type Gamers Night events, believing there was a deeper connection between video games and hardcore music fans that was soon validated by the cultural influences of Konami's Beatmania franchise. Within a few years, the advances of a rapidly developing internet led to a rise in various collectives producing their own spin on underground music genres. To many rhythm game players, Hardcore Tanoshi stands out as the oldest and most established example behind this new era of niche self-published hardcore music. Many of the artists who contributed to these groups would sometimes form smaller subunits, often dedicated to harder variants of hardcore music, or to pursue another genre they seldom explored before. It's very rare for doujin producers/composers not to contribute at least one track towards a compilation album during their activity, as it could be argued that this collaborative practice is what founded J-core's diverse range of sounds during its formative years. A number of these unique takes on hardcore and gabba styles would inspire new artists to experiment with lesser explored genres, leading to a melting pot of ideas that would create new breakthroughs rarely found elsewhere. Furthermore, the proliferation of rhythm games meant that hardcore techno and J-core music rapidly found an audience within and outside Japan, leading to an explosion of overseas influences that would only continue to grow as rhythm games became more popular and accessible to more people. Like many facets of otaku culture that would later gather wider internet recognition during the 2000s, Hardcore Tanoshi saw its humble beginnings in the depths of image board culture, more specifically, the DTM board on 2channel, all the way back in June of 2003. The circle would then release its first compilation album, titled Kimaila 8K, no less than 3-4 months later. J-core music was already being shared through Japanese peer-to-peer networks during this time, but the success of Kimala 8K and contemporary releases like Sharpnel's aptly named P2P establishes the idea that J-core was one of the very first music genres to be heavily shaped by the internet in some form, long before the establishment of other internet genres like vaporwave and hyperpop. Additionally, there is evidence to suggest that J-core had managed to find its way outside of Japan before the advent of public video hosting sites like YouTube, as publications on DJ Sharpnel were featured in publications such as the Dutch J-culture fanzine Anyway as far back as 2002. One such Anyway article written by Boris Postma first attempted to coin otaku speed rave as a name for this new variant of Japanese hardcore, named after the event where this music was widely heard, but the term ultimately wasn't adopted. Many artists from across Japan offered contributions to hardcore Tanoshi compilations throughout the early mid-2000s, with emerging producers such as M Project and MIDI featured alongside newcomers that later became synonymous with J-core, like Tapazalite and the circle's founder, Red Alice, then known as Akai Hito. Not only did this provide an outlet for many doujin artists to reach wider audiences, it also provided J-core with more opportunities to spread beyond conventional underground avenues by directly connecting with like-minded producers and listeners who were interested in these new sounds. This would lead to J-core collectives forming their own events and parties centered around the genre, which held an additional benefit of letting fellow producers network among one another. For example, the Tanoshi crew would host release parties a few weeks after publishing new compilations, which featured special guests who would later contribute works to subsequent albums, such as DJ Shimomura. Additionally, developments in online infrastructure like live streaming allowed J-core groups to further spread their reach without the need to rent venues ahead of time, an opportunity that many artists would increasingly take advantage of as the technology improved throughout the next decade. On the other hand, this approach often had a similar effect in the opposite direction. J-core producers like Betwixt and Between would regularly feature at events focused on other genres like freeform hardcore, using their platform to promote their work through initiatives like the freeform-orientated Energetic Romancer. There was a symbiotic relationship between the J-core landscape and other underground music scenes through events hosted in person and online, as they fostered environments to share less popular styles of music with people who otherwise had few sources to these genres at the time. One side effect of encouraging a cultural exchange between music communities in this manner was the crossover facilitated between various spheres of otaku subcultures, as producers and illustrators from a variety of backgrounds would almost inevitably offer something towards J-core. Blasterhead, a producer better known for his work on a number of cult classic visual novels produced by Kero Q, had one of his first credits under the alias in a track to the 2002 Sharpnel release Cross-Rated.
Select your battleship.
Blasterhead was no stranger to the J-core scene, having previously encountered Sharpnel at a Gamers Night event in the late 90s, then later paving the way for professional illustrators, like Itaru Hinue, to create J-core CD jackets instead of using characters from other properties without permission. He would continue to dabble in visual novel compositions throughout the decade, while also regularly producing standalone hardcore techno and chiptune releases on the side. Blasterhead still occasionally contributed to the wider doujin sphere for a number of collaborations in the 2000s, eventually collaborating with then Tanoshi regulars Red Alice and DJ Technotch on the creatively named Blasterhead vs Hardcore Tanoshi. This coincided with the period where Blasterhead became a unit again with the inclusion of Taishi, an artist now best known for his numerous contributions to influential doujin labels like Diverse System and Waveform. In a similar vein, fellow visual novel arranger and marking a newcomer DJ Technetium would become a regular to the doujin music circuit in his own right, regularly featuring in Tanoshi compilations from the group's inception until the end of the decade, while consistently releasing his own catalogue under his Cis Trance label. One of his most notable early releases was Technetium vs Raveros, The Game Addicts, a 2004 collaboration with fellow Tanoshi unit Raveros. This album showcases the heavy anime and video game inspirations that J-core is typically known for, while also providing a subtle example of the musical talent that doujin producers were able to cultivate in a field with virtually no creative restrictions. Technetium could lean into darker elements of hardcore techno to create a deeper punch to his choice of kicks, while the Raveros duo of Betwixt and Between and DJ Hase could seamlessly pick and mix their respective styles for an esoteric selection of music. Collaborations like these demonstrated the range of talents under the Tano-C umbrella, as it demonstrated that there was a place for varieties of melodic hardcore to work together and capture an otaku audience not solely focused on anime and gaming culture. It can also be argued that J-core artists were able to use these learning opportunities to innovate outside of the scene just as much as they did within. Buzzmaster was one such artist who demonstrated this, acting as an equal tour de force in both the J-core and wider hardcore scenes across Japan during his tenure. He first featured in compilations hosted by MIDI label Maddest Chickendom alongside Blasterhead, before featuring in a number of J-core related releases throughout the 2000s. Some prominent examples include his tracks in mixed Raver Rose albums, and his early appearances in the popular J-core Bastard Pop Terrorists compilation series, alongside a number of prominent names: M Project, Raver Rose, Sharpnel, DJ Shimamura, and DJ Technorch, among others. However, Buzzmaster is notable for his equally impressive contributions to hardcore scenes outside of Japan, partly thanks to his involvement as 1/3 of the Full Circle DJs unit. Thanks to the initiative of fellow member DJ Yosuke, who served as the group's primary contact for many collectives like the UK-based Electronica Exposed and the wider freeform scene, the Full Circle DJs had two of their releases, Psychedelic New Rose and Big Kisses and Darkness, licensed and available to a potential European audience. DJ Yosuke soon followed this precedent with Hardcore Baby's Revenge, a mixed compilation album that featured the works of prominent freeform and breakbeat hardcore producers from all over the world. This places a spotlight on J-core's global connections during its early years, as there was a clear indication that artists and potential audiences outside of Japan were starting to learn about the developments that had taken shape in Japan's music underground with the improvements to communication and information distribution facilitated by the internet. Buzzmaster and his crew wouldn't be the last attempt for J-core collectives to try forming international connections, but they should be remembered for their achievement in being one of the first. In August of 2007, Hardcore Tano-C would release a new compilation at Comiket 72, featuring a variety of regulars who would see their stars continue to rise in the following years. Hardcore Syndrome is notable for being one of the first major J-core releases to feature tracks produced by artists outside Japan, as UK-based artist Jackazid was responsible for the opening track, Cascading Emotions, under his Joshka alias. He had first heard of J-core and DJ Sharpnel through his exposure to rhythm games like Konami's Dance Dance Revolution, but became interested in the style of UK hardcore and machina cultivated by labels such as MPT and their Bastard Pop Terrorist series, as these records were starting to be exported to the UK. This again suggests how J-core had a degree of online recognition outside of Japan before the popularity of YouTube, as many European fans and producers like Jackazid first learned of the wider music scene through rhythm games, much like fellow fans in Japan. Fellow UK-based producer Tanuki recounts that he would mostly browse the Groovy website for new releases, eventually moving to more accessible social media platforms like Twitter to better stay informed and connected in the wake of their greater international adoption. This is how Jackazid was able to contact fellow J-core artists like M Project, DJ Shimamura, and Buzzmaster. These connections provided him with music resources and trade skills like utagoe ripping for clean vocals and J-core remixes, landing him a feature in Bastard Pop Terrorists Volume 5 right before the release of Hardcore Syndrome. His contributions towards these albums, and towards mid-2000s J-core as a whole, highlights a diverse understanding of J-core's compositional structure that fits right at home with the public's contemporary impressions of the genre. One explanation for why J-core was able to find an audience outside of Japan is due to the increasing accessibility of online piracy that developed alongside other aspects of the internet. Some dedicated fans and producers have argued that piracy sources like Napster and SoulSeek allowed people to discover inaccessible music and connect with independent artists without the resources for physical releases. But others argue that illegal downloads run contrary to the culture of underground music and financially supporting the environments that made music initiatives like J-core possible by buying artists' music. Both perspectives are supported by services like YouTube and Spotify, which have proven equally influential and problematic for smaller music artists in the wake of unauthorized re-uploads and false copyright claims since their inception. A number of doujin artists like DJ Technotch and Rough Sketch hold relatively mixed opinions on illegal downloads, mainly due to the variety of positive and negative impacts that many fellow artists have experienced alongside the increased attention towards their music. Additionally, some figures lament a shift towards digital media, removing the individuality that made early J-core so special, as there's a unique connection between underground music and physical releases that creates its own community of collector culture. While I personally can't condone piracy, it plays a critical role in understanding J-core's international proliferation, for better or for worse. I previously mentioned that a number of J-core artists would often use their influence and connections to the scene to promote other events with a tighter focus on a particular theme or subgenre of hardcore. Music events centered around the Toho Project series became a staple of the doujin space from the mid-2000s onwards, with parties like Technetium's Toho Carnival and DJ Technotch's Mega Pier establishing the game's music as an integral part of the broader J-core and doujin landscapes. That being said, the otaku audience cultivated by circles like Hardcore Tanoshi generally stuck to their comfort zone with regards to J-core events, as harder styles of music tended to attract a dedicated audience that appeared intimidating to the average J-core partygoer. I asked Plasma Dancer, owner of the Japanese-based freeform hardcore label Thank You for the Horse, as to whether there was any notable overlap between J-core and freeform hardcore events during his early DJ career. It was very rare to see a Tanoshi fan at events like Energetic Romancer, but they did start to trickle in over the years. One of the biggest reasons they would give for not coming along earlier was the intimidating atmosphere of things like Romancer or Tokyo Hardcore Construction, as the freeform scene here had roots in club subcultures that J-core definitely didn't. Elements of goth, punk, or industrial, and the dark raver aesthetic that people from the otaku cultures of Tanoshi didn't have much experience of. It wouldn't take long for them to realize how welcoming the freeform scene was, but that was a huge barrier in general, that both scenes were working from very different starting points. The foundation of events like Codex attempted to bridge this gap in the 2010s, featuring early Tanoshi headliners like Alabaster and Technotch, alongside newly emerging freeform talents such as Les Dos On. Plasma Dancer notes that there were definitely ravers at Codex who were Tanoshi fans during the event's lifespan, but also remarked that fellow Romancer attendees felt a clear shift away from the darker roots that had established the Japanese freeform scene. On the other hand, there were a number of guest appearances at Codex that may have bolstered the appeal of freeform hardcore for J-core fans leading up to the present day. The Finergy pioneer Alex Zahala was credited with attracting a number of disenfranchised Romancer faces during his feature at Codex 5, while Ikaruga Nex is noted as an important connection linking the J-core and freeform scenes together with his attendance at multiple related events. Though J-core was relatively separate from the developments of other underground music scenes for the majority of its early history, there is a clear influence from the musical trends of genres like freeform hardcore that allowed it to grow to the degree it reaches today. It's also important to talk about the contributions of Japanese freeform artists who shaped part of J-core's rich soundscape, as it's an element left relatively undiscussed until fairly recently in the genre's history. In History of Japanese Hardcore Techno, author Yuta Umagatani states that Hardcore Tanoshi pioneered a hardcore movement that was very different from the 90s hardcore scene centered on club culture, owed in part to their melodic hardcore style that featured unique takes on mainstream hardcore, freeform hardcore, and happy hardcore. Plasma Dancer suggests that Betwixt and Between had a massive influence on Tano C and the J-core scene, as the unique connection that only he and Rave-Rose Kolikase held to the Finnish freeform sound created a distinctly dark tone of hardcore music that virtually no other J-core producers were able to reproduce. You can notice samples of this Finergy influence throughout many Tano C releases following Hardcore Syndrome, as a few contributors adapted some of the techniques featured in Finnish freeform into their own J-core tracks. One track that personally comes to mind is Crossbreeding by Red Alice from Hardcore Syndrome 2, distorting the sweep effect with heavy filtering to create a transient kind of harsh sound, in tandem with the track's chaotic lead melody. A few artists would pick and choose elements of freeform hardcore to incorporate into their work, like the dark atmosphere embraced by DJ Technorch, but only a select few of those Finnish connections like Betwixt and Between were able to innovate upon that sound with a new niche of Japanese freeform. What makes Betwixt and Between's work so distinct from his contemporaries was his willingness to try a variety of genres, rather than limiting himself to freeform hardcore or J-core styled machina. His 2011 solo album Nanosecond Eternity showcases a mixture of heavy hardcore subgenres, like his attempt at UK hardcore with Unseen Entity, and a radical take on dark psytrance and hard energy with his long edit of Hydra. Thanks to his friendship with fellow Japanese freeform artist Gold, Betwixt was able to refine his own style of music into something completely different from other contemporary J-core and Finergy producers, by seamlessly incorporating elements from both sides into music that was far removed from anyone else at the time. His sound was clearly recognisable even among the diverse lineup of Tano C, as a different choice of genre like industrial hardcore still demonstrated a similar impact on his peers throughout his time as a regular headliner. Fellow contributors like Umbrella and Thanatos highlighted the effects of Finnish freeform towards J-core to a smaller degree, as both utilised elements like hard energy leads and heavy distortion to push a darker sound rarely seen in J-core compilations at the time. Additionally, Alabaster is credited as an important figure with regards to the impact of freeform hardcore on J-core music. Though he was typically on the outskirts of the main Japanese freeform scene, his appearances at events like Project Karma showcased the demand for his distorted, often gritty take on freeform that garnered praise from ravers and Tanoshi fans alike. The heavy filtering and distortion that would become Alabaster's trademark was another key tool shared with other contemporary hardcore artists, as it would often be used in tandem with industrial kicks to form the basis for J-Core's heavier undertones in the late 2000s. His use of Finnish-style filtering made him an ideal middle ground for J-Core fans interested in freeform hardcore at the time, as the impact of his contributions is still clearly felt by hardcore Tanoshi today. Or at least, that's what I think, if his inclusion on the 20th anniversary celebration website stands as any indication. Either way, freeform hardcore played a crucial role in shaping the sounds of J-Core through its incorporation of more industrial hardcore elements, as it allowed producers to embrace a pool of inspirations that invigorated a darker side of J-Core music. Though freeform is much less popular within the doujin climate nowadays in comparison to hardstyle and speedcore, its presence on the J-Core landscape of the 2000s cannot be overlooked when understanding how the genre later reached conventional appeal. 2010 was a landmark year for J-Core releases, as many new and existing circles continued to refine much of the framework that was established in the prior decade. The J-Core Masters compilations introduced a number of overseas talent to the J-Core scene, like the UK-based Tanuki and Argentinian producer Roundwave Crusher, among others. Many of the artists featured in these releases have since appeared in a variety of compilations across a range of genres, with Umegatani stating that these international contributions helped to revitalize the Japanese hardcore scene in the next decade. On the domestic and export sides, Japanese artists like DJ Shimomura and Rough Sketch were increasingly releasing their work on overseas labels across Europe, while doujin labels like SketchUp Recordings, now Hyperflux, and Japanese Stream Hardcore showcased upcoming talents such as DJ Genki and DJ Myosuke that continued to further diversify the sounds of J-Core on Japanese hardcore music. This coincided with the renaissance of rave music occurring at the same time, as the Italian label Gabba Eleganza brought attention to the fashion aspects of the hardcore techno and gabba scenes that formed an intrinsic link between underground music and underground fashion. Freelance music article writer Yuki Noise states that high-end fashion brands like Balenciaga and Miu Miu releasing collections inspired by rave culture brought fresh eyes to the hardcore techno scene, as it reinvented the genre as a community that appealed to everyone while broadening the inspirations that J-Core could take notes from. 2010's J-Core was spreading at a significantly faster rate than in the prior decade, with much of its spread being attributed to the Japanese hardcore scene receiving more attention and coverage from overseas producers and reporters. It should also be noted that the increased accessibility of rhythm games during the 2010s played a dedicated role in J-Core's sustained coverage overseas. Konami had improved the e-amusement service for their Bemani franchise of rhythm games, allowing them to update and patch games online without the need for yearly security dongles and upgrade kits. This had the side effect of requiring games to remain connected to Konami servers for operation, as games would refuse to boot if not connected. In 2011, fans outside of Japan would create Programmed World, a fan project aimed at unlocking this online functionality to arcade cabinets running legitimate data, as a way of continuing to fully experience games like Beatmania 2DX without having to physically live in Japan. To explain what Programmed World did in very simple terms, a combination of a private key and a router flashed with a VPN provided you access to a server that enabled features locked behind e-amusement services. I must again stress that I don't condone piracy in any way, but it's undeniable that the accessibility provided by services like Programmed World, combined with the popularity of the rhythm game Osu, created another gateway for new fans of J-core that was entirely different from the genre's existing preconceptions in the 2000s. Many producers inspired by Beatmania artists, DJ Technoch in particular, now found themselves encouraging a new generation of doujin artists with their work. A number of the artists I've mentioned throughout this video have produced music for 2DX, DDR, and Sound Vortex. It can be argued that modern rhythm games have created an Ouroboros of interest for J-core and doujin music, as many contemporary producers and fans work with the nondescript goal of having their work eventually feature in a rhythm game someday. The new decade was also significant for hardcore Tanoshi, as the circle quickly cemented itself as a major figure in the wider J-core scene in the period following Hardcore Syndrome. The circle would continue to host events following their rename, with the Tanoshi Strike series of events proving to be successful initiatives for cultivating a large audience. These events served as release parties for new albums, doubling as extra publicity for the artists who contributed to them. Being hosted at venues of decent size like Shibuya Buenos and Amaterasu indicates some degree of contemporary popularity, considering the former venue could hold a maximum capacity of about 300 people. 2011 was a particularly important year for hardcore Tanoshi, hosting a number of albums that could be considered influential to the circle's future creative direction. I already discussed Nanosecond Eternity by Betwixt and Between, which put the spotlight on an incredibly talented artist known for pushing the boundaries of hardcore music by means hardly covered by anyone before. On the other hand, you had Bright Colors, which aimed to showcase a mostly brighter spin on Japanese hardcore, as the doujin scene experimented with more industrial music subgenres. Bright Colors was notable for being the debut Tanoshi album of Aran, an upcoming producer who quickly became an established member of the circle alongside other major independent labels like Unitone and Autographic Music. However, this would also mark Betwixt and Between's last original contribution to hardcore Tanoshi before his passing. There's an argument to be made that this led to the group adopting more of a UK hardcore sound in the following years, as the freeform elements introduced by Betwixt and other early contributors were slowly phased out in favour of the mainstream rave vibes associated with 2010's hardcore techno. Jakuzit defines J-core as hardcore techno with a uniquely Japanese taste. In essence, Japanese artists' interpretations of hardcore and its various subgenres, rather than simply hardcore music produced by Japanese artists. Whether you agree with this definition or not, the doujin music scene has exploded in the years that followed compilations like the inaugural Hardcore Syndrome and J-core Masters, focusing more on specific subgenres or thematic sounds rather than the broad spectrum of hardcore music categorized as J-core. Some labels like Megarex pioneer a niche in the demographic with a unique perspective on rhythm game music that births new genres, while other labels that evoke the club sound spirit reminiscent of late 2000s J-core collectives like Lilium Records pursue a tighter thematic focus with how they categorize their releases and individual music styles. That being said, the spirit of early J-core is still alive and well to this day, with the self-descriptive mashcore genre invoking the long-buried practice of subculture sampling like tradition never truly left us. Artists like Katagiri and Sabisi modernized the foundations established by nerdcore old heads for a post-COVID audience, thanks to true DJ Mag top ranker's song Zenpen reaching the public consciousness through Osu right at the height of COVID. Meanwhile, Rave Station Records continues to fill the demand for J-core the old-fashioned way, with Rave Station Underground and NTSC J-core hosting a number of old and new faces to the genre side by side. Though J-core started out as a catch-all term to define Japanese hardcore techno releases, the modern scene's diversification and specific classification of music releases has led to the genre becoming a distinct category in its own right. Richard Andrews, the owner of Electronica Exposed, expressed a demand for freeform music, irrespective of the country of origin, from music lovers across the world. I wager that contemporary J-core artists shared a similar sentiment, and continue to do so now, irrespective of how their music is categorized. To summarize, J-core as a genre was established on the principle of making hardcore techno music more approachable to video game and anime otaku. Many fans of the subculture who shared an interest in hardcore music collaborated with one another and shared inspirations through their network of connections, which diversified the sound of J-core through broadening the pool of musical talent. Like-minded producers and DJs would host events focused on certain aspects of J-core or doujin culture, which served to advertise upcoming releases/talent and attract new faces who could offer innovative ideas of their own to the wider music scene. A few artists familiar with certain genres of hardcore like Machina and Freeform offered their own contributions to J-core in a number of ways, which showcases the genre's diverse sound and possibly contributed to perceptions as a hardcore music made in Japan throughout the 2000s. However, these contributions highlighted a clear international appeal to Japanese hardcore techno, with overseas producers and fans paving the way for a second wave of popular attention that continues today. While J-core started out as a means for otaku to develop an interest in hardcore techno, it quickly established itself as a pioneer of internet music genres, and now serves as a gateway for rave culture that's accessible to just about anyone in the world. In my summary of how J-core was initially conceived, I briefly referred to DJ Sharpnel and the nerdcore-oriented events that would inspire similar artists to establish the genre's musical foundations. Many refer to DJ Sharpnel as playing a significant role in analysing the developments and subsequent growth of J-core before the 2000s, but the origins of such a figure must also be explained to form a greater understanding of J-core in its early years. In 1996, a collective of young music producers founded the group Project Gabangelion, a creative portmanteau of Evangelion, referring to the show Neon Genesis Evangelion, and GABA. The group would become high-speed music team Sharpnel and establish the Sharpnel sound label a couple of years later, which coincided with their debut release, Sharpnel vs Project Gabangelion. It should be noted that the Sharpnel name initially referred to a group of 5, with the most prominent members, Jaya and Lemmy, eventually forming the DJ Sharpnel unit in 2001. With that in mind, people unfamiliar with this period of J-core will refer to Jaya and Sharpnel interchangeably, due to being the main producer during this early period. For the purposes of this piece, any mentions of the name Sharpnel will be used in specific reference to the group itself, unless stated otherwise. Sharpnel vs Project Gabangelion follows many of the same conventions that codify nerdcore techno, with a focus on high BPM anime sampling throughout, and the group's mod tracker origins at front and center in the album art. This release is notable for establishing a continuity in early Sharpnel works that will become relevant later on, as tracks 9 and 10 are carried over wholesale from Project Gabangelion's promotional release, Hardcore Mania Club. However, this kind of hardcore was obscure in Japan, garnering poor reception from conventional GABA and hardcore techno fans, who thought of the overall motif as too hot off the press. Rather than leaning towards old culture becoming the new vogue like nerdcore techno, the high-speed music team took inspiration from contemporary media they were fans of, like the aforementioned Evangelion. A prominent example of this current-day inspiration can be heard in the intro track of Versus Project Gabangelion, sampling the present-day, present-time sample from Serial Experiments Lane, a show barely 1/4 of the way through its original run period during the album's first print.
Present day. Present time.
This didn't deter the Sharpnel crew from having fun, using their music to evoke the spirit of watching anime late at night. The group's concept was to dance from music that comes from a CD, which was a novel concept in the newly established Japanese hardcore underground scene. Jaya notes a degree of interest in what was seen as a funny take on hardcore techno, integrating several parts of otaku culture into Sharpnel music with the aim of broadening the appeal of nerdcore to more typical otaku fans. In spite of this frosty introduction, this new generation of Japanese hardcore led by members of the nerdcore event Speed King widened the scene's horizons like never before, attracting a wide demographic of styles and listeners in a similar vein to the impact rhythm games would harness during this same period. I explained this growth in more detail during the previous section, but one aspect I want to bring attention to is how Jaya, and possibly the other members of high-speed music team Sharpnel, viewed their perceived influence on what later became known as J-core. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Italy developed an interest in anime and manga similar to Japan's engagement with the otaku subculture, adopting such aesthetics and related cultural practices into the public consciousness despite the internet's relative infancy. European hardcore units like the Italian-based Trance Generators featured anime-styled artwork on their vinyl releases, which left an impression on Jaya and other contemporary J-core artists due to how far the aesthetic had spread. It can be argued that the use of cutting-edge otaku media by Sharpnel created a unique appeal for Japanese hardcore techno overseas, as European underground producers took more interest in this novel presentation style that was not existent in their corner of the world. However, it should be noted that this was not the sole reason for J-core's popularity in the 2000s, as the existence of aforementioned music events like Gamers Night and Speed King showcased how Japanese producers interpreted underground music trends differently from fellow artists in Europe and the United States. While Jaya and fellow nerdcore/J-core artist C-Type frequently cite the Speed Freak as their musical inspiration for incorporating anime samples into gabba and hardcore, C-Type states that Jaya is the driving force for why Japanese hardcore continues on in the modern day. In interviews throughout the 2010s, Jaya has consistently viewed his music through the lens of hardcore techno, but is aware that people often referred to his style as J-core. The term originates from DJ Neodash, a Dutch DJ who coined the description when introducing Japanese hardcore to European audiences in the early 2000s. Jaya comments on how J-core is categorically impossible to define from several angles. Many examples of J-core actually fall under a variety of genres, like Machina and Gabba, among others. Like DJ Shimomura, he states that not every track defined as J-core by overseas fans can be counted as such, adding that Japanese samples or characters alone don't strictly characterize a work as J-core. On the other hand, Jaya acknowledges the timing of such a term coinciding with the rise of doujin music, and the need to define hardcore released at Comiket and other similar events. This discussion supports the idea that Sharpnel was a pioneer of early J-core, as Jaya's influence on how the genre is defined highlights the number of collaborators and connections that Sharpnel was able to galvanize during their activity. To quote C-Type's perspective on Jaya's significance for J-core, the J in J-core stands for Jaya. Following the release of Sharpnel vs Project Gabangelion at the end of July 1998, high-speed music team Sharpnel quickly set off to work on their next release. Titled Double Dutch, Jaya describes the production process as something of an online collaboration with fellow member Le Cobrata, as the two exchanged mod files online during the planning stages. Double Dutch was set to first release at the second Music Media Mix Market event in October, which gives it some degree of historical significance considering how important M3 is for doujin music releases today. Unbeknownst to many at the time, this would be the only time the album ever saw distribution, as Double Dutch was quickly discontinued by the Sharpnel team on the return home from M3 that night. Jaya outlines why the group made this decision in the 2015 retrospective booklet Sharpnel Sound Chronicle. Many of the tracks did not fit the vibe of nerdcore-like joke material established by their previous releases, with a much darker sound in comparison to Versus Project Gabangelion. The group unanimously thought, this album isn't quite right, isn't it? Shelving it out of a sentiment that it strayed too far from their core goal of making hardcore techno and gabba music fun for an otaku audience. Nonetheless, Double Dutch ran adjacent to the high-speed music team's increase in scope, as Lemmy's extensive experience with cosplay dance parties and live shows presented many further opportunities for the group that marked the start of their new identity as a nerdcore-like rave circle in subsequent months. It makes sense in retrospect why high-speed music team Sharpnel wasn't satisfied with Double Dutch when listening to it now. Even with low-quality rips and YouTube archives masking a number of details, much of the album feels incomplete in one way or another. A number of tracks are mixed in a way that makes the samples sound compressed and drowned out. High Tension and High Speed Star are prominent examples in this regard, as the vocal samples used in these two songs are relatively quiet as a result of being washed together with the gabba kicks used in production. Jaya addresses this in Sharpnel Sound Chronicle, as the recordings in Double Dutch contained an anti-phase effect that removed the vocal elements in some tracks. Production information for certain tracks also suggests there were other issues that contributed to the album's generally unfinished feeling, like Jaya's recent move to Tokyo and worries over sound quality standards when playing the group's music at live shows. With this in mind, one can imagine why this was a notable departure from the conventional Sharpnel sound for a variety of reasons. The group would continue upwards from this point, using the lessons and music from this period as a learning exercise that saw further refinement over the next decade of activity. Double Dutch would quickly become the outlier of Sharpnel releases, though not for the reasons that its members would have predicted. Sometime after being pulled from circulation, Jaya suffered from a hard drive failure that resulted in the loss of the masters for Double Dutch, as well as the masters for the Intercal album From the Heart. According to him, about 40 copies of the former were ever produced and or sold, with the latter album having anywhere between 5 and 10 copies at rough estimate. This has caused both albums to become something of an urban legend in fan communities, as any information on them is scarce at best. Double Dutch is listed on the old Sharpnel releases webpage, as well as the booklets for Attack the Sharpnel and Yonder Dome, but little further information on the album existed prior to 2015, outside of a corresponding video game music database entry from 2008. In most cases, this would be a minor footnote towards the history of an influential J-core artist, but the circumstances surrounding Double Dutch and its impact on Sharpnel's musical direction provides additional historical significance towards understanding Jaya's contributions to the genre during the 2000s. I previously mentioned that early Sharpnel releases often formed a self-referential continuity, with some older tracks being refined in later albums. Double Dutch was no exception to this rule, as many tracks saw updates through the remainder of High Speed Music Team releases prior to the group's disbanding in 2001. Their subsequent work, From the Heart, Jigokuhen, featured a number of remixes from the previous couple of albums. The live version of Heart Attack was re-edited as 2 Happy Mix, while High Tension was reworked into Idol, Aniki Posing at Dance Party version, with added vocal samples taken from live performances by Lemmy's dance party circle, Pio Pio Dan. Jaya's willingness to revisit these tracks suggests that he didn't view Double Dutch in an entirely negative light, as they showcased a number of production ideas that would see future appearances. For instance, the track Destrudo Reaction is cited as the inception behind Jaya's Killing Scum alias, being partly inspired by the sound style of Japanese underground hardcore label Hyper Rich. Regardless of whether Sharpnel admits it or not, the album was a gateway to exploring other subgenres of hardcore that would contribute to J-Core's diverse sounds upon reaching Europe in the mid-2000s. One particular track that stands out for its later reappearances is High Speed Star, as it became Sharpnel's unofficial live anthem of sorts during this period of activity. Jaya used elements from his remix of the Kara techno song Furo to create this new song from the ground up, consistently featuring this new extended version in subsequent High Speed Music Team albums. Accounts suggest that High Speed Star was positively received by fans and members alike due to its frequent appearances on and off stage, since Jaya was open to it becoming a mainstay of the group's sound as they otherwise tried to centralize their own individual sounds. On the other hand, you can hear shades of what made Jaya's style a genre codifier in various iterations. The predominant use of a popular vocal sample, in this case Starlight by the pop group Hikaru Genji, is turned into a fast-paced hardcore remix that contested the sounds of contemporary nerdcore techno. Techniques like Utagoe ripping were still relatively primitive in 1998, but tracks like High Speed Star proved that Jaya and Sharpnel were ahead of the pack with how they were able to repurpose samples in such a creative way. Jaya describes From the Heart, Jigokuhen, as the album that first showcases his happy sounding nerdcore, and you can argue that Double Dutch contributed to this development with the ideas it planted. High Speed Star continued appearing in later High Speed Music Team Sharpnel albums, with the final iteration, Exciting Hyper High Speed Star, taking musical cues from the similarly niche Eurobeat genre. This can be seen as a landmark of sorts for how Jaya was changing his production methods, as this coincides with a gradual shift away from mod trackers that began with the release of 1999's Rave Spector. Many contemporary trackers had no capacity for effect plugins, which meant individual channels had to be exported from Impulse Tracker as WAV files so that effects could be applied and mixed using other editing software. It's likely that limitations caused by music production software and the advent of online networking caused Sharpnel, and possibly other well-known J-core producers, to reconsider how new ideas in music were shared in the new millennium. You can see how much the internet shaped Jay's early transition to DJ Sharpnel in the 2000s with P2P, doubling as a swan song for his mod tracker years, and an acknowledgement for the new methods championed by later artists. Double Dutch laid the groundwork for how Jay and Sharpnel would change J-core in later years, and part of that is owed to the relationship he formed with High Speed Star when finding his musical style. I've talked about Double Dutch at length, but what was the album actually like? Let's take a few minutes to sample what it had to offer, so that we can understand its historical significance towards DJ Sharpnel and the works that defined early J-core.
驚き上手。若い子眠くない
ワイヤードはあくまでも情報を伝達し、コミュニケーションするための空間、リアルワールドと混同してはいけない。
違うよ。
え？
そんなに境界ってきちんとしてないみたいで。
It's hard to discuss how J-core became what we know it as today, even in spite of how much information is available on the subject. Even though J-core is something of a cultural phenomenon in the wider context of otaku culture and music game consciousness, I was genuinely shocked at how poorly documented the earliest years seemed to be as a whole. One of the most significant reasons I had for starting work on the topic to this degree was trying to answer the question of how come nobody's tried to piece together what early J-core was like, and realizing that a lot of the information on hand would have to be compiled from scratch. A lot of the information in this video has only been recently discussed within the last 3 or 4 years, which makes me wonder how much more of early J-core history will go uncovered in the near future. I imagine the average music game player's understanding of J-core ends at the fringe releases of Comiket or M3 events. It's not much of a stretch when you learn a new fan's primary exposure to the genre is specifically hardcore tanoshi and rhythm games like Osu and Waka. These avenues have become increasingly accessible for people with an interest in new music, and rhythm game developers seem to be aware of this as more upcoming artists submit their work to a variety of different titles. There's a clear history that the average fan is slowly becoming more aware of, especially when we learn how popular artists like Camellia were inspired by Bimani and early 2000s J-core. Either way, it still brings up the question of why early J-core has fostered relatively obscure discussion until recently, and why information on how the genre has evolved is scarce even among Japanese fans. The internet was a valuable resource for staying informed on new events and updates at the time, so why is so much information so hard to find without asking artists and fans directly? Who knows? Reading about early J-core history was an eye-opening experience for me, as someone who didn't know much about this period until fairly recently. I knew that DJ Sharpnel was important in establishing many aspects of the early genre, but learning about other aspects with comparatively less coverage, like the impact of freeform hardcore, has been an enlightening journey into how much impact J-core has towards independent underground music. I think back on albums like Double Dutch, or the work of artists like Betwixt and Between, and ask myself whether we would see this pocket of music without these influences pushing the boundaries of creative networking as they did at the genesis of the internet. A lot of new fans are starting to rediscover this era of J-core like I am now, so I'm glad that more attention is rightfully being placed on the efforts behind what created a bustling music culture. There's a lot of cool music out there, and it's a shame that it's gone undocumented for so long. Seeing J-core continue to evolve alongside the old internet makes me nostalgic for that experimental Wild West that's seldom explored nowadays. A lot of tracks from 20 years ago represent the uncertainty of what J-core was intended to be, providing a metaphorical answer to an equally open-ended question. You'd get the upbeat happy hardcore style mixed in with heavy industrial sounds, and it didn't matter which of these was the correct form of J-core at the end of the day. Artists were producing music based on their personal views of otaku media, which then influenced how people saw the subculture through a lens of interconnectivity. Maybe Sharpnel was more of a pioneer than we give him credit for, forecasting the importance of the internet as a hub for sharing new ideas all over the globe. I hope that more people take interest in how J-core came to be, and foster a greater interest in preserving some of the history that brought it here. People talk about the trend of otogekko and how rhythm games have standardized a genre of music unbound by traditional restrictions, but I look forward to seeing how much further J-core can continue to innovate in the next 25 years to come.